Okay, this should go without saying. Spoilers for Avengers Endgame ahead. Time travel. I've seen a lot of people confused about how time travel works in the MCU. I've heard many talking about the paradoxes and all the plot holes in Avengers Endgame. Is Loki still out there? How did Thanos die twice? How did the snap still happen if Thanos died 4 years younger? How could older Nebula kill younger Nebula? A lot of people don't seem to quite understand how time travel works in the MCU. So this is what most people assume time travel is like in the MCU, that the heroes go back inside their own timeline and change events. This is likely because of the usual depiction of time travel in movies. Doctor Who, Bill and Ted, Terminator, Back to the Future, they all follow this line of time travel where going back to the past affects the future. And they even address this. Hulk himself dismisses this depiction of time travel as false because your own past becomes your future, and you know that events didn't happen this way. And yeah, there is that whole thing of Back to the Future is a bunch of bullshit. On first watch, I assumed what Hulk meant was that it was like Harry Potter. If you've seen Prisoner of Azkaban, you know you can go back in time and but you aren't changing events, you were just always part of events. Technically, you don't have free will, you can't actually change anything in the timeline. The timeline is set in stone. But eventually, after a few inconsistencies with that theory, such as Loki's escape or things that didn't happen in the original MCU timeline, I realized that they aren't traveling back to their own timeline, they are creating different new timelines that don't affect anything that happens in the main MCU timeline. So if they went back and killed baby Thanos, it would create a new timeline where Thanos died as a baby, so the snap doesn't happen. But in the original MCU timeline, nothing has changed. In the main MCU timeline, Cap goes back into the ice in 1945, and Peggy doesn't see him until he wakes up in 2010. Cap does not live with Peggy through 1945 up until 2023. Nothing significant happens in 1970, Loki doesn't escape in 2012, Rocket doesn't shank Jane in 2013, and Thanos doesn't die in 2014. The main MCU timeline as we know it is set in stone and always happens the way that we have seen it play out in the earlier movies. The snap cannot be undone, it is an established event in the main MCU timeline. So when Cap, Bruce, and Scott all travel back to 2012, they are changing the course of events in a new timeline. In the main MCU timeline, there's only one Cap and Tony, but in the new timeline, let's call it the 2012 timeline, there's two of them, one from the 2012 timeline and one that travelled back from the main MCU timeline. It's in this new timeline that Tony goes into cardiac arrest, Loki escapes, and Hydra probably thinks Cap is one of them now. This changes events in the new timeline. I would say maybe Cap finds about Hydra pretty quickly because they all think he's one of them and can take him down from the inside. And Loki isn't in Thor the Dark World, meaning Thor likely gets killed and the Dark Elves ended the universe. Or possibly Thor stops it and Loki might still be alive in the alternative timeline. But in the main MCU timeline, none of this happens. It all happens as we remember it, and Loki is still dead. Now, there is another event that happens in the 2012 timeline which has confused some people. It's when Bruce talks to the Ancient One about taking the Time Stone. Many people have found this a bit confusing, but the Ancient One clearly states that removing the Time Stone would benefit their reality, so the main MCU timeline, but not her own. In other words, while the main MCU timeline would benefit, the 2012 timeline would fall into chaos without their main weapon against interdimensional threats. She could be vague, but if you think about it, if the Time Stone wasn't returned to Doctor Strange, there would have been no way for him to defeat Dormammu, and so the universe would have just ended in 2016, which could have been why the Ancient One was reluctant to part with it. So after the Space Stone was stolen by Loki, Cap and Tony go back to 1970 to find more Pym particles and to find the Space Stone. In doing this, they create another timeline, let's call it the 1970 timeline, where nothing really changes. Tony talks with his dad, and Hank probably freaks out about some missing Pym particles, but in the end, nothing really changes and the events continue as normal. So meanwhile, Rocket and Thor head back to 2013 and create a new timeline. Let's call this one the 2013 timeline. And in this timeline, all that changes is that Thor chats with his mother and Jane gets shanked by Rocket. That scene looks really weird out of context. Anyway, they also take Mjolnir from, I think that's how it's pronounced, Thor's old hammer from this timeline, and Cap returns it at the end with the Infinity Stones. You see it in the quantum tunnel with him before he goes. And the fact that Loki is still imprisoned on Asgard confirms the fact that this is a different timeline from the 2012 timeline, where we've established that Loki escapes. In this timeline, Loki doesn't escape, it's in line with the original. Then we get Hawkeye, Black Widow, Nebula, and War Machine heading back to 2014, creating the 2014 timeline. In this timeline, they knock out Star-Lord and take the Power Stone. Black Widow is sacrificed at Vormir, while in the original MCU timeline, Red Skull probably just chilled out on his own for the whole day. Main MCU Nebula also gets captured by 2014's Thanos. 2014 Thanos then travels to the main MCU timeline to prevent the Avengers from reviving everyone who died in the snap that occurred in the main MCU timeline. As Thanos and Nebula are from the 2014 timeline, nothing that happens to them affects main Thanos or main Nebula, the ones that are from the main MCU timeline. This is why it's not a paradox for Thanos to die twice, and why main Nebula, isn't affected by killing her younger self, because no matter what may happen on the other timeline, the events of the main MCU timeline remain the same. This also means that 2014 Gamora remains present in the main MCU when main MCU Gamora died in 2018, and she has not come back. The original main MCU Gamora is dead, so the one that Star-Lord is searching for at the end of Endgame is the 2014 Gamora, and is a different version than the one he was in a relationship with. The fact that these three characters are absent from the 2014 timeline from 2014 onwards has a few interesting implications for the 2014 timeline. For one, the Guardians would probably never have formed because Gamora wouldn't have been there to fight Star-Lord. The police only stopped the fight on Xandar because they drew much attention to themselves. Without Gamora there, Rocket probably would have kidnapped Quill quite successfully and gotten his bounty from Yondu, and then Yondu maybe would have sold the Power Stone to the Collector after finding out what it was, or Ronan would have got a hold of it and destroyed Xandar. But Drax will remain in prison, and without Thanos, because Thanos disappeared from 2014, the snap would be averted. So in the 2014 timeline, there is no snap, but for the main MCU timeline, nothing has changed. Just because Thanos died in one version of 2014, he still lived through the original version of 2014, and the snap still happened. The last instance of time travel in the movie is when Cap heads back to return all the Infinity Stones. Cap goes back to all the different timelines and returns the Infinity Stones back to their rightful places and times. Returning the Soul Stone must have been an interesting scene. Kind of upset we didn't get that. But now we get the one inconsistency with time travel in the movie. Cap goes back to 1945. It's probably 1945 anyway. The song that Cap and Peggy danced to is A Long, Long Time Ago by Harry James, which topped the charts back in 1945, and the cars that drive along the street seem to back it up, so I think we can assume he's in 1945. Anyway, the inconsistency comes with Cap showing up in 2023. If Cap had travelled to a different timeline, then he couldn't just reappear in the main MCU timeline by living through all the years in between. Luckily, I do have an explanation that satisfies that. Cap travelled back to 1945, yeah, and he created a new timeline, the 1945 timeline, in which he lives a good long life with Peggy Carter until her death in 2016, as it was originally. As Peggy died of natural causes, it seems safe to assume that she still died in 2016. In the 1945 timeline, the same probably happened. So let's say that Cap did something in the past to deal with the whole Thanos situation so the snap never happens. That would mean that Hank Pym would complete his experiments with the quantum tunnel by 2018. Cap could go back to the original timeline by meeting Hank Pym, and who by 2023 should have a fully functioning quantum tunnel. Let's just assume that Cap lost his Pym particles somewhere along the line, and that's why he couldn't go back through the portal where Falcon pulled him out. He travelled back to 2023 using the quantum tunnel that Hank Pym had produced in the 1945 timeline, and he arrived on the bench where he spoke with Sam and Bucky. Of course, going back to 1945 and living through until 2023 does make Cap 118 physically. 183 if you count the years in the ice, but physically 118. You can kind of write that up to the super soldier serum, making him age a bit slower than the average man, though. But my explanation seems to fit it all together quite well, so I think it works there. So that is how time travel works in the MCU. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Check out my Endgame review if you're looking for more on Endgame, or if you have any interest in Doctor Who, I've got plenty of videos on that at the moment. I will see you all again next time. Do check out my other videos. Goodbye.